Just measuring a few things, making sure there's no big differences. Since I've got some junkyard parts here, you got to measure it where there's no chassis paint so you get an accurate number. Write all this stuff down. Okay, just checking some stuff. Here's the old thrust bearing that goes underneath the steering knuckle. $58.85. And here's the new one. $58.50. 3/1000ths of an inch difference. But you know what? This old one, the grease in this old one it's got a lot more grease in it, and it's thick and kind of it still moves freely, but the grease is really thick in there. And the new one here is it's got grease in the ball bearings, but doesn't seem to have as much between the outer shell and the inner piece. So, and I do have these shims, so when it goes together I'll be dry fitting it together and make sure I don't have any up and down movement, and shim it as needed. Just making sure what I believe to be the original support is the same dimensionally as the junkyard part. When you go to install the steering knuckle, you need to make sure you're putting the passenger side on the passenger side and driver's side on the driver's side. The way you tell is you look at the center line of the kingpin, you notice that the offset here is larger on top than it is on the bottom. So this is the top of the knuckle, and then your Zerk fittings for your grease face the front of the car. So this right here is the driver's side. Packing grease in the thrust bearing just like you would a wheel bearing. Okay, so when you install the thrust bearing that goes right here between the support and the knuckle itself, you want to make sure that the outer race, where it's all one piece, faces up. See this, the inner race, you can see the gap right here where the way they're put together. You want that facing down. Just set it in place, slide the unit on, and then check it for play, and you just wiggle it up and down. You'll be able to see the play. You'll be able to feel it actually as well. Then, so I've got a little bit of play there. So you get these shims that come with the kingpin kit. Slide that in place. Make sure you're centered. Got to kind of move it around and move it with your finger till it centers itself on the bore. Might take a little doing, and then you can see the play is gone. There's no more up and down movement. Still moves freely though. And just make sure that shim stays centered. Make sure your bearing is centered. And then the next thing is to go ahead and slide the kingpin in. Before you install your kingpin, you need to mark each end with a Sharpie parallel to your notch, so that you always know where the notch is, because as you drive the kingpin up into the support, it's going to tend to rotate one way or the other, and depending on which way it rotates is going to dictate from which direction you drive your lock pin in from. If the kingpin rotates slightly counterclockwise, you're going to need to drive your lock pin in from the back, and vice versa. If it rotates slightly clockwise, you're going to need to drive your lock pin in from the front. And after you drive the kingpin up into the support, just take a flashlight and look and see which way the Sharpie line has rotated. Okay, so when I drove the kingpin up till I had about the same margin, I can feel it with my fingertips, same margin top to bottom. My kingpin, the notch in the kingpin is lined up with the hole for the lock pin. But now, by looking at the mark I made on the kingpin, I can tell that the kingpin has rotated slightly counterclockwise. So if I try to drive the lock pin in from the front, I'm going to hit the kingpin and I'm going to damage the lock pin. So to conform to the book, the lock pin should go in from the front. However, since the kingpin has rotated, I'm going to have to initially drive the lock pin in from the back, and that will rotate the kingpin back into place. Then I can drive the lock pin back out and install it from the front like it should be. Alright, and that's about how much the lock pin was sticking out originally when I took it apart. So that looks correct. So as the lock pin came all the way through and bottomed out, you noticed that the steering knuckle rotated very slightly. That was the kingpin straightening up. And I've already driven the lock pin back out, and now I'm going to drive it in from the front. And incidentally, you can also take an old lock pin. If you think that the kingpin has rotated a little too far and you're nervous about whether the holes are going to line up, you can take an old lock pin and just break that edge off with your grinder, sort of put a very slight bevel right around there, and that will help ensure that it engages the slot when you drive it in. But leave as much of this area untouched as possible, because it's this area here that's going to engage with the notch and rotate your kingpin back into the correct position. Okay, and the last thing to go in is the dust covers for the kingpin. You got one on top and you got one on the bottom, and they're dish shaped with the convex side facing out, whether it be on top or on the bottom. You want to make sure that it's facing out. And after you drop it down in, you can take a flat punch, the biggest flat punch you got, and a hammer, and you tap the top of it, and the idea is to cause it to spread out in the bore of the knuckle, and that's what holds it in. They also come from the factory, I believe, staked, so you want to also stake the edges to keep it from falling out. And when you go to put grease in the zerks, you'll know if they're going to stay in. They'll pop out. The grease will pop them out if they're not in correct.